Hi, everybody. I'm Sasha Rabkin. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Equal Opportunity Schools.
Hello, I'm Kia Franklin. I have the pleasure of working with Sasha. I serve as Chief Program Officer at Equal Opportunity Schools.
Greetings. Yes, my name is Leon Gray. I am an associate professor of educational psychology and equity in the College of Education at NC State.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alon Hope. I am an associate professor in psychology at North Carolina State University.
Why was it important to write and publish the article, Black and Belonging at School, a case for interpersonal, instructional, and institutional opportunity structures?
What inspired us to write this article was we noticed that something was missing in psychology as it pertained to conversations around belonging. And that was an ecological perspective on belonging that really thought about systems as areas of intervention. So the dominant discourse around belonging at the time was on the perception of the individual. But we also wanted to acknowledge that belonging has deep structural roots that are rooted in systemic injustices for students from historically marginalized populations.
Yeah, as we were coming up in our scholarship and beginning to write this paper, we had a lot of more knowledge of different police killings and vigilante killings of young Black people. So not only are we looking at our research in schools, but we're seeing the community context that Black youth are growing up in, where, sleeping on your couch, going to the store, walking in your neighborhood are dangerous. And so we wanted to situate belonging, not just in terms of, how does it work in the classroom with one teacher and one set of peers, but how does this work in context of how even schools were created, right? Schools were not necessarily created with every youth in mind in an equitable kind of way.
I think one of the things that is so powerful about the work, and I think what really resonated was this real interrogation of the assumption of belonging in racist education systems. In our work, as we were learning about this, we saw a lot of educators mistaking acquiescence for belonging and acquiescence to the dominant normative systems that really came down around things like behavior, around things like fitting in, around things like not rocking the boat, around these very racialized and I think damaging to the spirit of young people assumptions that belonging was somehow about fitting in to a very often violent and racist education system.
Yeah, and I'll just, continue to add, I think as we sat down to write and began to draft and edit and redraft, we thought, okay, what is belonging, right? But then also, why would you want to belong and why wouldn't you, right? The assumption that it's natural and that a student wants to belong. But if we take it beyond the interpersonal dimension and we consider institutions and we consider broader structures, then we can really understand maybe there's some larger changes that need to happen so that students not just feel a acquiescence, right, as you mentioned, but that students feel this is a system and structure that I want to invest in as a scholar.
What also is important about what's been said and what we hope to convey in the article is that what we're bringing forth is not new, and the reason why that's important to understand is because there is a history of striving, for justice, for more, right, in this country, for our rights as citizens. And as we think about that, we have to think about what happened, with these untold stories or stories that were silenced, distorted, forgotten, suppressed in history. And we thought about the platform of educational psychologists as one that may have not had that message, shared before, in that outlet, but was very much so important.
I think one of the largest takeaways from this scholarship for our team was really this reminder of the importance of authoring and defining terms and reclaiming authorship and the ability to own and define terms. So just even the call out of the lack of reliance on sufficient reliance on expertise from Black researchers and scholars, educators and students, when we talk about what belonging even means, really resonated with our team as we thought about the ways that we're trying to be disruptive of established canons of research that exclude voices of the folks who have the most firsthand experience, and yet are marginalized when it comes to conversations about educational equity.
How was the research evidence described in the paper taken up in practice?
For me, one of the biggest things that I learned working with other after school and out of school time organizations was just the overwhelming need and desire to make structural and systematic changes, right? That seeing that these kind of piecemeal approaches and focusing on individuals isn't always sustainable, and a lot of burnout happening in organizational structures. And so that's what I brought to kind of the article, is thinking, okay, we have interpersonal and individual level interventions, but what can we suggest and recommend, and how can we think about this with that broader ecological frame that takes the onus off of one organization, one phenomenal teacher, one phenomenal director, and can really think more strategically about long-term systemic change.
What we ended up doing is building what we call the cues, experiences, and conditions of belonging diagnostic, that it is not in and of itself diagnosing belonging. It is putting a mirror up to the system to say these cues, experiences, and conditions that are noticed and identified by your young people in our research correlated to their reported feeling of belonging. The reported feeling of belonging did correlate to their achievement, and we can show some through line, but what we want to be able to assess with you and hold the system accountable for are the contours of these opportunity structures. And so it allowed us to say that there are things to which we can show school districts and schools that they can then influence, things like culturally relevant teaching, things like conversations about race, things like getting high quality feedback from your teacher, that lead to and correlate to students feeling like they belong in a system, but it can't happen in a vacuum. And so for us, it really was a fundamental shift away from the kind of what we used to call like the microscope to the student, to the mirror to the system, to say what is, again, upstream from these feelings of belonging. What are the cultural, political, racial conditions that need to be created?
What advice do you have for other intermediaries seeking to promote equity and inclusion in education?
One of my biggest pieces of advice is to be humble. So oftentimes in academia, as we get trained as researchers, we're supposed to know, and we're supposed to know how to know if we don't already have an understanding of a topic. And that's what we get trained to do, to know things and to learn how to find out new things to know. And that can undergird kind of an elitism that is sometimes associated with researchers in academia. And so to go into organizations and settings and recognize that people have their own knowledge and their own wisdom from years of experience, from traditions passed down, from ways of being and living that we don't know and may not fully understand. And so that humility to go into a space ready to learn, as well as ready to hear what organizations may need and how you may be able to use what you already know and understand to serve that community. So that's my primary takeaway for researchers.
Alon, what you shared really resonated in terms of, for an organization seeking to use research. I think one piece of advice would be to seek researchers that have that type of lens, the lens for humility, the lens for building grounded in purpose, grounded in a shared mission. And I think the second piece of advice that I would have for organizations would be to know the why of pursuing research. And I think that goes a little bit to what Sasha was talking about in terms of, what do organizations tend to value and tend to elevate. And I think the third piece of advice that I would have for an organization would just be to be ready to have your thinking changed. And, it's kind of like getting ready to embark on personal, therapy.
I think intermediary organizations are often prized, I think, for our alignment with dominant research structures, not for breaking them, not for disrupting them. We get more funding and more recognition the more our work dovetails specifically with the most accepted forms of research. And I think on one hand, that makes sense. On the other hand, I think it really limits the horizons of intermediary organizations to be thinking about and basing their work on existing scholarship that wasn't designed to promote or disrupt systems of inequity. And so I think for intermediate organizations, we really have to interrogate what research means to us, and what it means to understand how we apply research. And so often evidence-based as a concept is a watchword for the status quo.
I just wanted to say, in terms of advice to researchers, there are a few things that I wanted to think about in terms of thinking beyond disciplinary norms. The first piece of advice is around questioning conventions. You want to know the rules, but then you want to break the ones that just don't make sense for practitioners, or things that just don't make sense for the populations that you are investigating and committed to lifting up in your work. The second is around theoretical integration. Not everything is going to come from your disciplinary perspective. And so we have to weave psychological constructs, ideas, frameworks in with other culturalized critical frameworks to help give us a more integrated and textured lens and outlook on the issues that are facing our Black and brown babies in schools. So I want to challenge scholars to think about who is their public and how do they consume information already. And folding into that can be a very powerful way of thinking beyond our norms and to push towards social impact.
Your world might get shaken up, and you have to be ready to then kind of like, now that you know better, do better, that you have to be prepared to make the changes and to advocate for some really disruptive, possibly disruptive actions based on what you learn. And I think particularly when you pursue the research with the types of researchers that engage in community, engage in the work with humility, valuing the cultural assets and skills that folks have that they're already bringing to the table, that is the place where disruption happens, and you just gotta kind of put on your seatbelt and be ready for that to change some things pretty significantly.